Chapter 1, Lesson 4 of Algebra, and we're going to look in this lesson at the associative property. Remember when we introduced properties a couple lessons ago, I mentioned that one of the key things that's really helpful in mathematics is if we can remember the relationship between properties and which operations they apply to. And we talked about properties not always applying to all four, seldom applying to one, they usually just apply to a couple. So it's the same thing here with the associative property. The associative property is going to apply to the addition property and the multiplication property, but again does not apply to subtraction or division. So again, only two operations involved here, addition and multiplication, and the associative property is really essentially the same for both. So we'll take a look at both of those in this video, and then the next video we'll do some application of that and how we can write equivalent expressions using the associative property. The associative property of addition states that when addition is the only operation in an expression, or really if addition is in the expression, the parentheses can be moved without affecting the value of the expression. So we can move the parentheses around. Associate, associative, kind of the same word. Who we associate with, you can associate with these people, these people. So really the associative property is kind of like grouping the numbers together with different groups. And we use the grouping symbols, the parentheses, in order to do that. Now there's an important vocabulary word here, or translation word here, that we want to begin to use. We have these parentheses, and how do we say those in English? What are they going to look like in English? How do we translate those? And we're going to translate the parentheses as the quantity. So whenever we come to a parentheses and we're reading or translating a math sentence into English, we're going to, when we come to parentheses, say the quantity. And then we'll look for that when we're in English trying to go for math. So we'll do a number of examples. Hopefully you'll get the idea here. So the associative property of addition applies only to addition, or if addition is the only operation that we're working with. It allows us to move the parentheses, and when we see the parentheses we're going to say the quantity. So in my first expression here, 7 plus, and then I have parentheses, how do I say that? I don't say 7 plus parentheses 3 plus 5 parentheses. I don't say it like that. The correct translation would be 7 plus the quantity 3 plus 5. So instead of saying parentheses, I use the phrase the quantity. And I can associate, or I can move the parentheses, so rather than having 3 and 5 in the parentheses, because it's all addition, I can put the 7 and 3 in the parentheses instead. So I can associate with different terms. So in this expression I would say the quantity 7 plus 3 plus 5. Okay? And so the associative property allows me to change the association from 3 and 5 being in the parentheses to 7 and 3 in the parentheses. Okay? Now, there's a cadence to as you're reading this. How do we know when the quantity stops? And hope you notice that when I read this, I kind of had a pause before I said the plus 5, and that pause is what kind of indicates that the quantity is ended. So when you're translating or when you're reading these, you have to kind of change the cadence in your voice or apply a pause to indicate the parentheses is stopped, much like you would say a pause when you have a comma when you're reading in English. Okay? Now, the associative property of multiplication is essentially the same thing, except that we're talking about when all the operations between the terms is multiplication. And again, it allows us to move the parentheses, and again, I want to say the term or say the phrase the quantity when I come to the parentheses. So the associative property of multiplication allows me to move the parentheses around when I'm only moving it around terms where multiplication is taking place. And then again, I use the phrase the quantity. So the first expression here would be 7 times the quantity 3 times 5. And then I can change the parentheses and put the 7 and 3 in parentheses instead because it's all multiplication. And I would say the quantity 7 times 3 times 5. And so if I were to multiply these out or simplify these out, I would get the same answer. And so these are what we call equivalent expressions. And equivalent expressions are expressions that look different, but when we simplify them, we arrive at the same answer. Okay, so equivalent expressions, and we're going to use that phrase a lot as we go through math, are expressions that have the same answer if we were to simplify them. And the nice thing, or what we want to do when we're working math, the key to math really, is being able to change things from one expression to another without actually changing the answer I would get if I did that. And if we correctly apply the properties, we'll have equivalent expressions. It's when we misapply those properties, like use them for subtraction when they're not able to be used, that we don't have equivalent expressions because we're going to get a different answer when we actually go to simplifying it. Okay, so that's the associative properties, and in the next video we'll look at applying those to some expressions and then rewriting or writing equivalent expressions by applying these properties.